And so it begins, Chapter 1. 1910, United States of America. Jo sat primly in the rail car as it rattled its way from Chicago to Boston. As she was officially a guest of Dr. Theophilus Wilder, she didn't have to endure the stares of other passengers beyond Dr. Wilder and his research assistant, Edison James. A private rail car was her preferred way to travel, so when the doctor and his assistant had asked her to join them at Harvard in Boston, she'd agreed and suggested they use her uncle's rail car. It was, in fact, her rail car, as her uncle only existed on paper these days. Being a woman meant one had to make concessions in order for society to accept that she had access to certain things. Uncle Sebastian had been useful in some ways, but when he'd taken it all a step too far, Jo had made sure he could never take that step again. "If I could have your input, Mrs. Stevens," Dr. Wilder said, "I would appreciate it if you could go over these last few pages of the presentation." "Of course, Dr. Wilder," Jo replied, and took the pages into her gloved hands, careful to avoid where the ink was still wet. She read the pages, then handed them back to the doctor. "I'd add that the successes of Scotland Yard since their founding in 1829 have been extraordinary. Their criminal investigation department, a unit of plainclothes detectives, has been instrumental in stopping the Jack the Ripper murders." "They didn't find the killer, though, did they?" Edison James replied. His brown hair curled slightly and brushed against freckled skin, but it was Edison's brown eyes that gave away his intellect. "No," Jo said, "they did not. But they believe the person responsible was killed or confined somehow as a result of their investigations. In either event, the murder stopped." "No one ever did plainclothes detectives until Scotland Yard," Dr. Wilder said, "and they keep impressive records. The federal level of law enforcement in the United States is, on the other hand, an example of a useless collection of political chaos and games of power. Hopefully this presentation will encourage the creation of a more efficient way to handle law enforcement." "One can only hope," Jo replied. They went over the full presentation one more time, then Dr. Wilder smiled gently at Jo. "You should probably feed before we reach Boston, my dear. It's going to be a hectic couple of days, and we don't want you feeling peckish." "Very true. Thank you, Dr. Wilder." Jo rose and smoothed her skirts, then folded her gloves after removal and laid them on the table. She took off her coat and hat and gestured to Edison to join her on the settee. Dr. Wilder admired her trim figure, perfectly coiffed black hair, and vivid blue eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light against ivory-pale skin. He watched for a moment as she prepared herself, then turned away. Edison removed his suit coat and rolled up a sleeve before he sat beside Jo and extended his arm. She gave him a soft smile and lifted his forearm to her lips and bit. It didn't take much to sustain her, and the process wasn't as uncomfortable for Edison as it could have been, since one of Jo's gifts was the ability to charm him into forgetting any discomfort. Truth be told, she could have charmed him into forgetting the process altogether, but he was a willing participant, and that made it convenient for Jo and Dr. Wilder. The whole arrangement was highly unusual all around. Dr. Wilder was a witch, as was Edison, and Jo was a vampire. One of their other assistants was a wolf shifter who had stayed behind to handle the doctor's classes while they traveled. Most supernatural species were clannish, meaning they kept to themselves, and if they mingled with other supernaturals, it was to capture for study or kill the others. Their little conclave was unique in its makeup and focus. Not many supernaturals bothered with human laws and legalities. This meeting at Harvard was to present several new concepts in law enforcement to the human attendees. There was a lot riding on this presentation, as it would determine Jo's future for the next couple of centuries, and all of their futures for the next few decades. They left Boston 4 days after they had arrived, the mood distinctly different. "I don't like to think that was a colossal waste of time, but it was," Dr. Wilder grumbled. "It was in some ways, not in others," Jo replied. "It just means we have to do this on our own. Roosevelt has everyone all up in arms, with Congress accusing him of a grab for power, with his Attorney General Bonaparte renting out Secret Service agents for investigations," Edison said. "And yet our solution of federal-level investigative organization is heresy," Wilder said. "I will never understand these people." "Perhaps we need to simply take a page from Scotland Yard and do it ourselves," Jo said. Everyone went silent as they thought about her statement, then Wilder slowly started to smile. "When we stop in D.C., how about we make it a short stay?" "What do you have in mind?" Jo asked him. I have a friend who lives just outside of D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia. He's a witch, like me, and holds no bias against other supernaturals. His home would be a safe haven for us while we take a look around, Dr. Wilder said. His name is Elijah Stabler. His father ran an apothecary out of the home for a while in the mid-1800s, but the business was moved and he stayed in the home. Jo looked at the two men's faces, then bit her lower lip. Are you sure he's safe? I've not spoken to him in a few years. I can go see if he's still in residence and what the situation may be, and Edison can stay here with you until we know for sure, Wilder replied. I don't understand what we're scouting for in the D.C. area, Dr. Wilder, Edison said. Chicago may be our home for now, but it's not the political and legal hub of our country. However, that hub is rapidly developing in D.C., Wilder explained. If we're going to do this, we need to be near where the laws are made and where people with political power can smooth the road for us when necessary. Jo gave the doctor a slow smile. Now I understand. We're going to set up our own. There are many facets of this we need to discuss, however. Seeing as we're what we are, we should focus on supernaturals and humans that are aware of supernaturals. If we try to work with just human clients, in a decade or so it'll be untenable and we'll have to pack up and move. I've already taken that into consideration, Wilder said as he turned to Edison. What do you say, my boy? Interested in leaving Chicago and starting a new venture near D.C.? Edison looked a bit startled, then shook his head. I can't answer that right now. I'll need to consider a few things. My family still relies on me for support, and I'm not at a point where I have to move to avoid questions as of yet. I do want to be part of this project, but there's a lot to consider. You have 3 days, Wilder replied. You are a wonderful assistant, and you do good work, but I don't want you to go against your principles or the needs of your family. One thing to consider, however, is that D.C. to Chicago is only a train ride away. It's not like you're moving to the Wild West. I'm probably in, but I need to consider things before I just answer. I'm trying to be more considerate in my choices, Edison said. That's a mature answer, Jo told him. Whatever you decide, we're still here for you. I appreciate that, Mrs. Stevens, Edison replied. Thank you. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to go up to the front and make my list of pros and cons to help me decide. Wilder and Jo remained silent as Edison collected his letterbox and moved to the front of the train car where his bunk was located. The 2 single bed chambers were at the front of the car. The double bed chamber that Jo used was in the back, with the living and dining quarters in the middle. There were chamber pots and wash basins in each room, and the furniture had all been custom-made, as had been the fabrics, china, and crystal imported from Europe. It was luxurious by any standards, but the concept of privacy didn't exist as much as they would have liked. I hope he stays, Jo finally spoke after a few moments had passed. I'd hate to have to charm his memories away. It's not safe to let him go otherwise. I understand, Wilder said, and so does he. I'm sure that will go on his list. Would you like some tea or something stronger? Whatever you're having, Jo replied, and turned in her seat to watch the passing scenery outside the windows. I think we could take more than a few pages from Scotland Yard's experience and adapt them to our concept, much as we had explained in the presentation. A supernatural intelligence network where information is collected and shared among a select few to help stop serial criminals from being able to take their crimes from place to place and not be brought to justice. Dr. Wilder's eyes lit up as he handed Jo her drink. That's brilliant. The Supernatural Intelligence Network. S.I.N. is an excellent acronym, too. Perhaps the failure of our presentation at Harvard is a blessing in disguise. I think it might be, Jo said. We've got the information and abilities to make this work for our own people better than anyone else. The humans would never understand some of our reasons for doing things a certain way. And there's no way we could really explain it to them, Edison said as he stepped back into the main room. I'm in, all the way in. I can send money home and visit periodically and still be a part of building something the world has never seen. I'd never forgive myself for letting my fears keep me from continuing to work with the two of you. Dr. Wilder handed Edison a drink, then held his up in a toast. To making the future safe for all supernaturals. Hear, hear, replied Edison. And so it begins, Jo added as they touched glasses.